The topic of this video is the events that occurred under John Kennedy's presidency. Although JFK's presidency was short, his 2.5 years in office were extremely important years in American history. To start off, let's discuss how JFK became president. JFK ran against Richard Nixon in the 1960 election for the Democratic Party and won. This was an historic election because those who listened to the debates on the radio thought that Nixon had won, yet the people who watched the debates on television thought that Kennedy had won. He was sworn into office in January of 1961 as the 35th President of the United States. The significance of JFK from the start of his presidency was that he was an extremely young and was a baby boomer, which caused some concern on the conservative side because it was hard to determine what JFK would be like as president. Kennedy created a policy entitled the New Frontier, in which he introduced tax reforms, educational aid, and emphasis on the space program. The space frontier was one of Kennedy's long-lasting challenges to the country. He challenged NASA to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and in 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first human to set foot on the moon. Kennedy also created what was called the Alliance for Progress, which could be considered a Marshall Plan for Latin America. The goal of the Alliance for Progress was to resist communism. Communism was a threat the U.S. was afraid of for a while leading up to Kennedy's presidency, and the majority of Kennedy's foreign policy agendas had to do with communism. For example, JFK's biggest foreign policy matter was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. In October, the U.S. discovered that Soviet leader Khrushchev was storing Soviet missiles in Cuba pointed towards the U.S. The crisis lasted less than 3 weeks, which caused for Kennedy and his team to act fast. Kennedy decided on a blockade to prevent Soviet ships from reaching Cuba, and in the end, Kennedy agreed to Khrushchev not to invade Cuba and to also remove U.S. missiles from Turkey if Khrushchev removed missiles from Cuba. This was the closest that the world has ever come to a nuclear war, therefore making it one of the most extreme events of the 20th century. Kennedy also continued a dramatic increase in American troops being sent to Vietnam. America had been sending advisors to Vietnam since the early 50s, but over Kennedy's presidency, the number of soldiers in Vietnam more than doubled. This would leave Johnson to enter the presidency in a very difficult situation. On the domestic side of Kennedy's presidency was the Civil Rights Movement. Now, the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s was actually sparked by the 1954 Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Although desegregating schools, etc. did occur in some places during the 50s, main protests and actions occurred in the 60s. The first 2 years of Kennedy's presidency, he was involved in protecting James Meredith as he enrolled in Ole Miss, along with assigning his brother Robert Kennedy to protect and supervise the Freedom Rides in the South. However, 1963 was one of the most important years of the Civil Rights Movement. In the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King organized the March on Birmingham. The March on Birmingham was MLK's first major demonstration during the Civil Rights Movement, which is one reason why the protests of Birmingham are so important. In August later that year, MLK led the March on Washington and delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. JFK supported King's movement and approach and demonstrated his support for equal civil rights. On November 22, 1963, JFK was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. This was an extremely awful thing for the U.S. and is known as one of the most heartbreaking days in American history. Overall, the Kennedy presidency was a critical part of the 20th century, and the legend of JFK embeds the American people to this day.